Jason Lee Scott had one job at the end of Zeo: walk away clean. And he did it. He handed back the Gold Ranger powers, said his goodbyes, and that was it. The original Red Ranger was done with Power Rangers Turbo before it even started filming. And that's exactly why this what if matters. In the real timeline, he does pop up in Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, and then the TV season starts and he's just not there. No real send-off. No one last ride on the series side. He basically vanishes from the ongoing story. But here's what I keep coming back to. What if he didn't? Not in a vague fanfiction kind of way. I mean concretely, what would have had to happen contractually, practically, on the production side for Austin St. John to stay past Zeo? And what does the entire Turbo to In-Space arc look like if Jason Lee Scott is still in the room when the handoff happens? Because I think the answer changes almost everything. Not just for Power Rangers Turbo, which was already a mess before it aired, but for how In-Space gets set up, how the Zordon era ends, and whether the whole transition from the old guard to the Andros team feels earned or feels like it does in the version we actually got, which, let's be honest, mostly feels like a bus drove through Angel Grove and replaced half the cast while everyone was looking the other way. This is part of an ongoing series here on Morphin' Back. We already did What If the Original Cast Stayed for Zeo. Link is in the description. And the response to that was genuinely great. So we're pushing the thread forward. There are 3 realistic ways Jason stays for Turbo could happen, and we're going to explore all 3. We'll start with the most plausible one and work outward. Okay, let's actually set the stage, because the Zeo to Turbo transition is more complicated than it usually gets credit for, and most of the chaos starts here. Zeo ends, and the franchise actually has momentum again. The Machine Empire arc works, the stakes feel coherent, and the Gold Ranger storyline gives Austin St. John a real beat for the first time since Season 1. And then Turbo just throws all of it away. The Zeo to Turbo transition is genuinely one of the strangest whiplash moments in franchise history. You go from a team with years of established history, actual continuity, coherent villain stakes, to, here are cars. Divatox is here now. And then the show does the most controversial move it ever made in this era. It puts a kid on the team. Justin is the Blue Turbo Ranger in the real timeline. And if you like Justin, I'm not here to take that away from you. But structurally, it's the perfect place to swap in Jason. Here's the production reality that matters for our scenario. Turbo is tied to the movie. The tone gets pushed younger, and Saban is in cost management mode. A lot of the cast churn isn't a graceful creative plan. It's a business decision with story consequences. Austin St. John left before Turbo even began. His exit happens quietly. Jason hands back the Gold Ranger powers due to the incompatibility issue with his non-Triforian biology. Genuinely one of the better in-universe explanations the show ever produced for losing a Ranger. And then he's just gone. He shows up in Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, and then he doesn't get a Turbo season arc. He's basically absent from the show when it matters. So the fork point for our alternate timeline is this. What would have had to happen differently for Jason to stay? And not just stay, but stay in the most narratively useful slot, as the replacement for Rocky's seat in the lineup, instead of Justin. The most realistic version, and I want to be clear I'm speculating here based on production patterns, not anything documented, is that Austin St. John would have needed a new contract offer that was better than whatever he was walking away from, and a creative pitch that made Jason and Turbo feel like a feature, not a cameo. And the cleanest pitch is staring you in the face. The Blue Ranger slot. Rocky is gone by Turbo. In the real timeline, the show fills that space with Justin. In our timeline, Saban makes the more conservative, nostalgia-friendly move. They bring in Jason as the Blue Turbo Ranger from day one, including the movie, and they simply never do the Kid Ranger experiment. Here's the thing about the Turbo cast situation. They already had room. The show was going to move Tommy and the Zeo team into Turbo anyway. Adding Jason to that lineup isn't structurally impossible. It's just a slightly bigger cast. And by the time the mid-season changeover to TJ's team happens, you have an incredibly natural, dramatic engine. Jason is the last original Ranger standing, watching a new team take over the franchise he helped build. That's not just nostalgia bait, that's an actual story. Path 1, Jason replaces Justin. This is the version that makes the most sense if you're Saban. It's cleaner, it's safer, and it instantly fixes the weirdest optics in Turbo, the Kid Ranger. It also solves a practical problem Turbo has from day one. The team is already crowded with legacy faces, and Justin isn't integrated in a way that feels organic. If you swap Justin out for Jason, suddenly, the old guard isn't this awkward mix of Tommy, Kat, Tanya, and Adam dragging a child around. It's a team of peers with a shared history. And specifically, the blue slot makes sense for Jason in Turbo. Not because Jason is a Blue Ranger type, he's not. But because Red is already spoken for, Tommy is Red Turbo. That's the marketing, that's the movie, that's the suit footage. And if Jason is going to be on that team without turning the whole thing into a leadership civil war from episode 1, you put him in blue, and you let the tension simmer instead of explode. You get a very different energy inside the movie too. Because in the real film, the Rangers feel like they're doing a big brand transition, and the human dynamics are thin. In this version, every scene where the team argues about risk has weight, because Jason isn't just another teammate, he's the guy who used to lead. He's the guy who remembers what it felt like when being a Ranger was new and terrifying, and nobody knew if the command center would still be there tomorrow. So even if the plot beats of the movie are basically the same, the subtext changes. Tommy is leading because he's the current leader. Jason is questioning choices because he's the original leader. And that dynamic gives the team scenes a pulse they often don't have in Turbo. And it creates a genuinely weird power dynamic that Turbo never had. Tommy is the face of the franchise by this point. Jason David Frank is the guy on the posters. He's Red Turbo. He's the leader on paper. But Jason is the original Red Ranger. The first leader. The one who had to invent the job in real time, while the show itself was still figuring out what it was. So, the minute you put Jason back on the team, not as a guest star, not as Gold Ranger returns for 2 episodes, but as a core Turbo Ranger, you've got an unspoken question hanging over every single fight. Who is actually leading this team? Tommy has the current authority, Jason has the foundational authority. And if the writers are even slightly awake, that tension becomes the best thing Turbo has going for it. And here's the important limit. Jason doesn't magically fix Turbo. Turbo is adapting Car Ranger, which is a parody season. A chunk of the tone mismatch is baked in. What he can do is give the American scenes a spine. Even when the monster plot is silly, the team dynamics can still feel like something. Now we get to the hinge point. The mid-season handoff. Path 2 is the softer version of this, and it's worth mentioning. Jason stays, but not as a full Turbo Ranger. He's around the power chamber, he's in the room, he's a bridge character. The guy the audience trusts, but he's not in a suit every episode. A similar role Billy took on in Zeo. That version is cheaper, easier, and it still lets the franchise keep its new Turbo lineup intact. And if you're trying to be realistic about 1996 Saban, this is the version that feels most likely on a business level. Because you can keep Austin St. John around without paying for him as a full-time Ranger, and you can use him surgically in the episodes that matter. In this path, Jason becomes the human continuity glue. He's the guy who can walk into the power chamber and immediately make the place feel like the same world as Mighty Morphin, without the show having to do a single line of exposition. And he can do something Turbo desperately needed, validate the new team as an idea. Because one of Turbo's weird problems is that it doesn't treat the Ranger identity like something sacred anymore. People get swapped in and out, and the show shrugs. If you keep Jason in the room, even without powers, you can make the handoff feel like a choice with consequences. Jason can be the one character who actually reacts to it like a big deal. He can be the audience surrogate going, "Wait, you're doing what? Already?" That alone makes the season feel more grounded. But Path 3 is the one that changes the feel of the whole era. Jason stays long enough that the power transfer and the jump into in-space happen with him present. And this is where the Tommy-Jason dynamic stops being subtext and becomes the actual story engine. Because by the time you hit passing the torch, you're not just watching Tommy hand a Red Ranger power to TJ. You're watching Jason, the first Red Ranger, stand there and watch the 4th Red Ranger get created. That's franchise history in a single frame. And it also reframes Tommy. In the real timeline, Tommy is basically unchallenged as the leader by this point. In this timeline, Tommy is still the leader, but he's leading with Jason in the room, which means every leadership decision is now being made under the gaze of the guy who used to sit in that chair. That can be supportive, it can be tense, it can be both in the same scene. If you want a retention-friendly version of this, it's not Jason is there and everything is better. It's Jason is there and everything is heavier. Because now Turbo isn't just a goofy car season. It's the season where the old era watches itself get replaced in real time. I want to talk, specifically, about the mid-season changeover. Because this is the moment in Turbo that I think is most dramatically affected by the alternate timeline. In the real version, Passing the Torch, that 2-part episode where Tommy, Kat, Tanya, and Adam hand over their powers to TJ, Cassie, Carlos, and Ashley, lands softly. It's not a bad episode, but there's no real weight to it, because the Zeo team, Tommy aside, had become somewhat peripheral by that point in the season. The handoff feels like logistics. Tommy gets a nice moment with TJ, Rocky was already replaced by Justin earlier, and nobody made a huge deal of it. The whole thing is efficient and slightly sad, and then it's over. Now imagine that Jason is still there for this moment. And I don't mean standing in the back for nostalgia. I mean he's functionally part of the decision. Because if Jason is the Blue Turbo Ranger in this timeline, the replacement for Rocky's empty chair, the guy who took the slot instead of Justin, then the handoff isn't just Tommy's responsibility. It's the entire old guard, choosing their successors. So you get a scene before the handoff that Turbo never really gave us. The older Rangers actually talking about what it means to hand this over. Tommy is the face of the franchise, but he's tired. Kat and Tanya and Adam are tired. And Jason is the only one in the room who can look at all of them and go, this is the job, this is what it costs. And if we're handing it over, we need to be sure. That's where the Tommy-Jason tension pays off in a useful way. Because Tommy can be the guy who's emotionally attached to the identity, the suit, the legacy, the idea that he has to keep carrying it. While Jason is the guy who's attached to the mission. Jason is the one who can say out loud the thing Power Rangers almost never says. The point isn't us. The point is the team keeps existing. And then you can make the handoff itself hit in a way the real episode doesn't fully land. Tommy gives the red turbo morpher to TJ. That's already the headline moment. But in this timeline, Jason is standing right there, the first Red Ranger watching the fourth get created. And the camera doesn't have to explain anything. It's just visual math. And if you want one line that actually sticks, it's Jason looking at TJ and saying something like, don't try to be Tommy. Don't try to be me. Lead them the way you lead. That turns the scene from logistics into legacy. Actually think about what that scene becomes. TJ getting the red turbo morpher from Tommy is already a passing of a torch that goes back through Zeo to Mighty Morphin. But if Jason is in that scene, the original Red Ranger, the guy who held that red before Tommy ever did, watching the fourth person to carry the mantle of Red Ranger receive it, that's not just a handoff. That's a statement about the entire history of the franchise to that point. You don't even need dialogue that points to it explicitly. You just need Jason in the frame. The audience who grew up watching this does the math themselves. That's the moment. That's the scene. It exists in the alternate timeline, and it's significantly more powerful than what we got. And it sets up in space so much more cleanly. Here's where this really matters. The handoff from the Zordon era to the post-Turbo team, Andros and the Space Rangers, is one of the great pivots in franchise history. And in space is one of the great seasons. Countdown to Destruction is maybe the best finale the show ever produced. The whole arc works. But in the version we have, the connection between the original Ranger generation and what Andros and his team are doing is thin. You have TJ, Cassie, Carlos, and Ashley bridging from Turbo into space, and they're great, genuinely a great team, but they only had one season of history before they became the Space Rangers. The Zordon connection comes through Zordon himself and through Andros' mission, not really through the people on the team. Now imagine if Jason made it to the in-space handoff. Not necessarily as a full-time character in space, I don't think that's where this goes. But if he was present for the power chamber's destruction, if he was part of the moment where everything the original generation built goes up in smoke, and then the new team goes to space, his absence in space would be earned absence. He's a former Ranger. He doesn't have powers anymore. But the audience would carry him into that season in a way they can't right now, because he vanished quietly before Turbo even started. There's a version of Countdown to Destruction, where Jason's cameo, even a brief one, feels like the closing of a circle that started with Day of the Dumpster. In the real timeline, you'd have to do a fair bit of explaining to even get him into that scene, because his exit from the franchise was so unceremonious. In the alternate timeline, he's been there the whole time. Bringing him back for the finale is natural. It's earned. Let me deal with what most people get wrong about this, because I think the common fan argument goes in a direction I don't fully agree with. The argument you usually see is something like, if Jason stayed for Turbo, Turbo would have been a much better season. And look, I get the impulse. I understand it. But I think it misidentifies the problem. Power Rangers Turbo's real issues aren't a cast problem. They're a tonal identity crisis baked into the Care Ranger adaptation. compounded by the decision to make Justin a child ranger, without committing to the dramatic implications of that choice, and by the fact that the film that launched the season was made too quickly, with a script that never fully gelled. Jason Lee Scott being present doesn't fix any of that. He can't rewrite the Sentai footage. He can't undo the choice to aim the tone younger. He can't make Divatox a more consistent villain. What Josin does is provide an emotional through line, but only if the writers actually use him. Turbo's big problem is that it often feels like the show is killing time. So in the worst case version of this timeline, Jason is there and still gets underwritten. In the best case version, he's the anchor that makes the handoff and the power chamber destruction feel like the franchise actually knows its own history. So the honest version of the alternate timeline is this. Jason's presence raises the ceiling of what Turbo could have been. It does not guarantee that ceiling gets reached. In the worst case, you get a Jason Lee Scott who's just sort of around, showing up in some episodes and disappearing in others, being underutilized in exactly the same way that Adam, Tanya, and Kat were underutilized in the real Turbo. That would actually be worse than him leaving clean, because at least in the real timeline, his absence is just absence. An underused Jason is an active disappointment. The alternate timeline only works if someone in that production specifically writes to Jason's presence, specifically gives him scenes that justify why he's there. And that requires intent, which, to be fair, the Zeo Gold Ranger arc demonstrated was at least occasionally possible from this writer's room. Here's a thing I want to just sit with for a second, because I don't think it gets said enough when fans talk about this era. Jason's arc across the Zordon era is quietly one of the more complete character journeys in 90s action television. That's not a high bar, I know, but think about where he starts. Day of the Dumpster. He's 17, he's cocky, he's the best fighter in Angel Grove, and he's handed the keys to a team he barely knows. He leads them through everything. He's there for Tommy going from enemy to teammate. He's there for Zach and Trini leaving. He leaves himself, comes back years later as a fundamentally quieter, more focused version of himself, handles the Gold Ranger powers with dignity, and then has the presence of mind to give them back when he knows they're hurting him, rather than clinging to the identity. That's a character with a complete arc. And in the real timeline, that arc ends without acknowledgement. He just fades out. The show doesn't mark it. He doesn't get a goodbye episode. He's just gone by the time Turbo starts. And if you weren't paying close attention, you might not even notice at first. The alternate timeline gives that arc one more beat, a final act. And when you think about it, every significant Ranger in the Zordon era who mattered got a send-off moment of some kind. Tommy got his multiple times. Billy had his departure. Even Trini, Zach, and the others got written out with a clear event. Jason deserved the same, and in our timeline, he didn't get it. A version of Turbo where Jason is present for the power transfer and the power chamber's destruction, and then either leaves for college or walks away one final time. That's a proper ending. That's what the character earned. Let me talk about what happens to the in-space team's dynamic in this world, because I think it actually shifts in an interesting way. In the real timeline, when TJ's team goes from Turbo to space, Andros is a new character who has to establish credibility quickly. He does it. Carlos Valerte's arc in In-Space, Cassie's dynamic with the Phantom Ranger, Ashley and the team chemistry, all of that works. But Andros has to do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of why should we trust this new leadership? He's from KO35. He's been searching for Corone alone. He's not connected to the established Ranger legacy in any direct way. In the alternate timeline, TJ's team comes into In-Space with a full season behind them, and the implicit endorsement of Jason Lee Scott, who by this point is the longest-serving original Ranger the show has. That's a different starting point. Andros doesn't have to work quite as hard to establish himself as a peer, because the team he's inheriting has been vouched for by the most credible living Ranger in the franchise at that point. It's a subtle shift, but it changes the texture of the early In-Space dynamic. The new team isn't coming in cold. They're coming in with credentials. The one thing I'm confident about is the emotional continuity. The jump to space feels less like a reset and more like the next chapter. What I don't hold loosely is this. Countdown to Destruction hits harder in this world. Full stop. When Zordon asks Andros to shatter his tube, when the wave goes out across the universe and the era ends, if you've had Jason Lee Scott in the background of the preceding 2 seasons, carrying the weight of everything that's being sacrificed, that final moment has a different texture. The Zordon era ends, and the person who started it, or at least the person who was there at the very beginning, before Tommy, before the alien threats got truly cosmic in scale, he has to watch it happen. That's not just nostalgia, that's tragedy with a specific shape. Okay, let me bring this home. Jason staying doesn't fix Turbo. It gives Turbo a spine, a character with enough history to make the handoff, the destruction of the power chamber, and the jump to in space feel like one continuous story instead of a series of swaps. And if you're asking me which of the three paths is most plausible, honestly, it's path 1 or path 2. Path 1 is the Saban wants the safer bet path. Replace Justin with Jason, keep the cast older, lean on nostalgia, and hope the movie to season transition feels smoother. Path 2 is the budget and contracts win path. Keep Jason around as a bridge character without committing to him as a full-time ranger. Use him in the episodes that matter, and keep the show flexible. Path 3 is the dream version. It's the one that makes the franchise feel like it has memory. It's the one that makes the ending hit hardest. It's also the one that requires the most intention from the season that, historically, struggled to have intention. So here's my question for the comments, and I want a real answer, not just a vibe. If Jason is the blue Turbo Ranger from the movie onward, replacing Justin, filling the slot Rocky left behind, does that make the passing the torch handoff actually land with real weight? Or does Turbo still waste him the way it wastes basically everything else?